Welcome. This is the lecture on Austrian economics. First, Austrian economics refers to a school of thought, a set of theories. It does not refer to the country of Austria. The reason why it's called Austrian is that several of the founders of this school of thought were from Austria. So when mainstream economists wanted to criticize this new set of theories, they would say, oh, that's just those Austrian economists. The name stuck. And people in the Austrian school adopted it as their own. So today, an Austrian economist is someone who subscribes to these theories. They are not necessarily from Austria. These are some of the major figures of Austrian economics, starting with here Karl Menger and Eugen von Bombauer in the 19th century. Then in the 20th century, Joseph Schumpeter, Murray Rothbard. Always, every picture I've seen of Murray Rothbard, he's smiling. And a bit more recently, the two best-known giants of Austrian economics, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. If you had to pick one person as the founder of modern Austrian economics, it would have to be Karl Menger. He was one of the most important figures in the marginal revolution, which explained, finally, after a couple of thousand years of asking, why things have the value they do. That's the history of Austrian econ. But just like Marxism, Austrian econ is still active today. In the United States, major centers of Austrian economic theory are NYU, although I've heard that department is moving a bit away from Austrian econ, Auburn, and George Mason University, where I graduated. I should point out that although George Mason has a very large Austrian economic group, I was not part of that. I was part of the experimental economics group, so I'm not an Austrian, although many of my good friends are, so I know a bit about it. Okay. The two leading Austrian economists of the 20th century were Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. Mises in the 20s and Hayek in the 40s, 30s, 40s. Both showed that central planning in a complex modern economy not just hasn't been done successfully, it can't be done. It is theoretically impossible. It's impossible because centrally planned economies don't have true market prices, and prices contain information. Without that information, it's impossible to know the right economic decisions. Austrian econ is based on these 6 foundational assumptions: methodological individualism, subjectivism, the information content of prices, the necessity of private property, the heterogeneity of capital, and praxeology. And we'll go through them one at a time. First, methodological individualism. This means essentially that only individuals make choices. Large-scale economic behavior that we study in macroeconomics emerges. We say it is an emergent feature, coming about organically as the product of a large number of individual decisions. In mainstream macroeconomic terms, we would say this is a macroeconomic theory that has micro foundations. now, subjectivism. Carl Menger believed that value is completely subjective. A product's value is found in its ability to satisfy human wants. So value is not an intrinsic characteristic of an object. Value is an opinion people have about that object. The subjective theory of value contradicted Marx's labor theory of value, which said that the value of a thing is determined by the amount of labor that goes into producing it and has nothing to do with anyone's opinion about its value. The subjective theory of value in turn led to the development of the theory of marginalism, marginal utility, which says that how much you value a thing changes based on how much of it you already have. This solved the diamond water paradox, which asked, why are diamonds so much more expensive than water, when water is necessary for life and diamonds are not? My wife may disagree on that point. She likes diamonds. The marginal answer is that people already have a tremendous amount of water, so they don't get very much value, very much utility from one additional unit of water, the marginal unit of water. But since people generally don't have many diamonds, people place a high subjective value on one more diamond. The marginal diamond has high value. Menger also used his subjective theory of value to arrive at one of the most important insights in all of economics, that both sides can gain from exchange. This is one of the very core differences between Austrian econ and Marxist economic theory. Marx believed that an object has a fixed value equal to the amount of labor required to create it, and this value does not change based on who has it, who possesses the thing, or anyone's opinion of it. So if there's an exchange, one of these objects exchanged must have greater value than the other. And so in the transaction, one side must become better off and one side must become worse off. For Marx, it's a zero-sum game. So if a business owner is making a profit, it has to be because they're taking value from their workers. The early Austrians said, no, that's not right. The value of an object is not objective. It is not fixed. It's subjective. So two people can place different values on the same thing. And since different people have different opinions about the values of things, trade can make both sides better off, including trading your labor for wages. If I have an apple and you have an orange, but I like oranges better than apples and you like apples better than oranges, we trade. We're both better off. This can only happen if we place different values on apples and oranges. Value must be subjective, because if value is objective, as Marx claimed, then in the apples and oranges example, one of us is simply wrong. Either apples are worth more than oranges or oranges are worth more than apples. Now, the information content of prices. Prices convey information, and that information is what allows us to coordinate economic activity. 1,000 different prices in 1 million different transactions happening every second. And in each one of them, information is transmitted. The price of things in a free market economy, the price system, forms a giant decentralized information processing mechanism. In Hayek's famous example, if people see that the price of tin has gone up, That tells them that they should reduce the use of tin and switch to something else, maybe aluminum. People don't need to know that the cause of the price change was some problem in the tin industry on the other side of the world. It's a very efficient information processing system that coordinates individual economic behavior. Now, economists and social thinkers have recognized for a very long time that private ownership provides powerful incentives for the efficient allocation of scarce resources. But advocates of socialism believed that socialism could transcend these incentive problems by changing human nature. If exploitation was eliminated, then people would become like angels, and everyone would do the right thing for the society without having any personal incentive to do it. Hayek showed that even if this assumed change in human nature took place, socialism would still fail, because you can put all the power to make economic decisions in one place, in one set of hands, in the hands of the central planners. But you can never put all the information that you need to make good decisions in one place. That's because economic information is inherently decentralized. It exists in essentially an infinite number of small economic decisions that are constantly changing from one second to the next. It's impossible to collect all that information in an economy and put it in one place. And even if you could, and even if you had infinite computational power to analyze it, it still wouldn't work, because the information would be outdated and wrong a thousandth of a second later. Heterogeneity of capital. This means that not all capital is the same. In most of the models that we've dealt with this semester, we have assumed that all capital was the same, and we were just interested in how much of it there was. In Austrian economic theory, one of the core principles is that capital is not all the same. Right now, in Detroit, in Stuttgart, Hamburg, in Tokyo, people are designing cars that will not be bought by anybody for a decade. Now, how do they know how to allocate resources to achieve that goal? To build cars that people are going to want 10 years from now. Production is always for an uncertain future demand. And the production process requires different stages of investment, ranging from the very first ones, like mining the iron ore, to the very last stages, a car dealership. The value of all producer goods at each stage of the production process derive from the value consumers will ultimately place on the product being produced. The production plan aligns various goods into a capital structure that produces the final goods in, ideally, the most efficient manner. Now, if capital was homogeneous, if it was all interchangeable, all capital's the same, then it could be used to produce any of the final products consumers want. If mistakes were made in how the capital was allocated, those resources could be reallocated quickly and with essentially no cost toward producing the more desired final product. But capital is heterogeneous. An auto plant can make cars, it can't make computer chips. A shopping mall can produce retail sales. It can't produce iron ore. So the alignment of capital to produce various consumer goods, it's directed by, it's governed by price signals combined with the careful economic calculations of investors. But investors need good information to make good decisions. They get that information from prices because prices carry information. So if the price system is distorted somehow, if prices are wrong, then investors will be making decisions based on bad information. They will make mistakes. Eventually, mistakes will be discovered, and investors will change their decisions. They'll fix the mistakes. They'll stop making this and start making that. But because capital is heterogeneous, switching from making iron ore to making computer mice, it takes time, and it is not free. Wrong prices means wrong information, which means wrong investment decisions. And bad investment decisions end up wasting resources. The society becomes poorer than it would have been if capital had been allocated correctly in the first place. Praxeology. This is the deductive study of human action based on the notion that humans engage in purposeful behavior. This means Austrians tend to form their theories using logical deductions, starting with first principles. First principles, what we know is true about individual behavior, microeconomic behavior. And they build this up to a description of large groups, macroeconomic behavior. This is a very different way of doing business than mainstream economists. Mainstream economics tends to use math to answer economic questions. Austrians mostly use logical deduction. It's a bit inside baseball, but among academic economists like me, Austrians have a reputation of just not being very good at math. And for an economist, that's about the worst insult you can give. They actually do use some math, just not a lot. Okay. Austrian economics is an economic theory. It's a set of economic theories. It is not about what is right and wrong for government to do. It is not a political theory. It does not say that some action by the government is morally wrong. It does not suggest that the government's role is to do X instead of Y. It's not normative. It's positive, like mainstream economics should be. Austrian econ is descriptive. It explains what it believes will happen if government does X, and what will happen if government does Y. Whether government should do X or Y, or something else, that's not econ. That's politics. For example, an Austrian economist would point out, all else held equal, a government-imposed price ceiling below the equilibrium, that is a binding price ceiling, will cause a shortage. But an Austrian does not go on to say, therefore it's wrong for government to impose a price ceiling. That would be a political decision that would be based on values and opinions. This is another way that Austrian econ is very different from Marxism. That having been said, as I mentioned, there were a lot of Austrians at George Mason, and I knew a bunch of them. Austrians believe that the economy will operate more efficiently when the government, for the most part, stays out of it. Having the government get out of the business of telling people what to do is more or less what libertarians favor. So libertarians tend to like Austrian economics. And Austrian economists, good fraction of them are also politically libertarian. But as it says here on the slide, not all Austrians are libertarians, and not all libertarians are Austrians, and it would be a mistake to conflate the two. But it is a fairly common combination, just like most Marxist economists are also personally, politically on the far left. It's going to be very rare to find a Marxist economist who is politically a conservative Republican. Now, one of the most significant applications of Austrian economic theory in the 20th century was the socialist calculation debate. One of the dreams of socialism was that exploitation and inequality perceived to be inherent in the capitalist system could be eliminated by uncoupling the production and distribution of goods from the use of money. Instead of resources going to those who could afford them, they could be directed to those who need them most. Mises and Hayek both argued that this dream fails to take account of the knowledge problem. The knowledge problem is the problem created by the fact that the information that is most important to successful economic planning is only known to the man on the spot. This is the phrase used by Hayek in the use of knowledge in society. In order for an economic system to efficiently coordinate economic plans across thousands, millions, billions of people on the spot, whose actions affect the macroeconomy, there has to be some way for the knowledge and the plans of all these individuals to be incorporated into an economic decision-making process. Mises, Hayek, the other Austrians, said that for a system to do this, it must, one, have private property and private property rights. You own it, so you can make decisions about it. Two, it must have prices, because prices help you discover the most efficient use of your property. And three, it has to have profit, because profit is what gives you an incentive to use your property the most efficient way. In other words, it has to be a decentralized, free market-based economy. A central planner can't do this, because in the absence of this information and these incentives, efficient economic planning is always going to fail. This is why the attempts made in the Soviet Union and elsewhere to eliminate the market system had such disastrous consequences. These are some of the main topics that Austrian economists frequently address, and they all overlap to a certain degree. One major, maybe the major, application of Austrian economic theory comes from its explanation of the business cycle. Traditional Keynesian economics says that recessions, downturns in the economy, periodically happen, and this is how you fix them. But they don't try to explain why those downturns occur. Austrian economists have a very clear theory explaining why recessions and depressions happen. They claim to know the cause of the business cycle. Now, the Austrian explanation for the business cycle, Hayek did the most important work in this area early in the Great Depression. In a prior slide, I said that Austrians believe that prices contain information. So if prices are somehow wrong, then the decisions people make using that bad information will be bad decisions. Pardon me. This is the core of Austrian business cycle theory. When you're making a decision about how to invest your capital to build a factory or whatever, you look at the price of capital. That's the interest rate. When the interest rate is pushed off its natural equilibrium, usually by government action, it'll encourage people to invest their capital inefficiently. And when these mistakes are ultimately revealed, as they will be, fixing them is costly, and the society becomes poorer. That's a recession. And we don't come out of the recession until the incorrectly invested capital is shifted to its correct, most efficient use. Now, long-term capital investments, things that won't pay off for many, many years, are much more sensitive to the interest rate than are short-term projects, because in a short-term project, you only have to pay interest for a brief amount of time. In a long-term project, you have to pay interest on the loan for many years. So when the interest rate is pushed below its natural rate, its market equilibrium, borrowers will tend to shift their capital, shift their investment from shorter-term projects to longer-term projects, projects that would not have been done at the higher interest rate. But because the interest rate, the price of capital, is below equilibrium, the quantity supplied and quantity demanded of capital do not match. Just like in any other market, when the price is below equilibrium, there's going to be a shortage. So this sudden increase in business borrowing for investment is not sustainable. At a below equilibrium interest rate, there's not enough savings in the economy to finance all that long-term investment. Businesses will eventually discover, if the interest rate is still below equilibrium, that they can't refinance their loans because there's a shortage of investment capital. Or if the interest rate's allowed to go back up to equilibrium, well, that still won't help, because the projects, although they can be refinanced, they're not profitable at that higher interest rate. That's the whole reason why they were not done before, not financed at the higher interest rate. And they only were started when the interest rate was pushed below equilibrium. In either case, most of these long-term projects are going to fail. That's why in the real estate crash of 2008 that started the Great Recession, there were so many abandoned, half-built real estate projects on the one hand, or projects that were completed ended up being projects that were not profitable. Nobody wanted to buy them. You may have heard of China's ghost cities. If not, look it up. In China, they built multiple very large cities to stimulate the economy. They built them in the middle of nowhere. But now they're just sitting there, empty. These gigantic ghost towns that could fit 1 million people, and 1,000 live there. Eventually, all of these investments are revealed to have been a misallocation of resources, and the investments turn out to be unprofitable. A bust happens as the bad debts are liquidated and the economy eventually readjusts back to its pre-boom back to its pre-boom levels. So, Austrians believe that business cycles of boom and bust are caused by the government trying to stimulate the economy by pushing the interest rate below equilibrium. This does encourage investment and the economy does surge, but it's temporary. because all you've really done is cause an inefficiently high level of investment. And these investments, even individually, should never have been started in the first place. Austrians call this both over-investment and malinvestment. This is the Hayekian triangle. On the horizontal axis, you see how far removed investment is from the end point of being purchased by the consumer, where the profit is actually realized. You can think of things in the far left, like mining and refining, as requiring very long-term financing. But retailing, by contrast, only needs very short-term financing, because the time from when you purchase stuff from the wholesaler to when you sell it to the final consumer is very short. Now, on the vertical axis, this is the quantity of production. On the far right here, this distance is the quantity of goods actually purchased by the final consumer. Now, the slope of the line, this represents the interest rate. If the interest rate was very high, then longer-term investments like mining and refining would become less profitable, and less of it would occur. So this side of the triangle would be lower. And investment would tend to shift towards investments that are not so dependent on long-term financing, like retailing. So this would be higher. And the slope, let's see if I can draw it here. The slope would go from this black one, if the interest rate is higher, to something like that. Less of the long-term project, mining, refining, more of the short-term investment in retailing and wholesaling. There we go. Now, graph 1, down here in the lower right, shows supply and demand. It's just a supply and demand graph for savings and investment. Price, the interest rate on this axis, quantity of savings and thus investment on this axis. Now, if people simply change their preferences, they decide to save more, then the supply curve will shift from S1 to S2. People have, for some reason, changed their time preference. So at the same interest rate, they're willing to consume less and save more. The interest rate goes down, and the quantity of savings and investment goes up. Now, graph 2 in the upper right, this shows the possibility frontier for various combinations of consumption and investment. Now, if people save more money, they're going to have less to consume. So consumption goes down. And the lower interest rate causes investment to go up. So you move from here to here. The third graph, the one on the top left, is the Hayekian triangle. It shows the level of investment on the vertical axis here, and the stage of production on the horizontal axis. Iron ore would be, mining would be here on the far left, assembly of car parts into a car that's sold might be here on the right. Now, since consumption has gone down, investment in the later stages of production here, the right side of the triangle, will also go down because they react more quickly to changes in consumer spending. Think retail business. But production at the earlier stages, the left side of the triangle, they're less sensitive to consumption spending. Imagine if people reduce the number of frying pans they buy, that will not immediately have any real effect on the production of iron ore in the mining industry. So the lower interest rate increases total investment, but also shifts investment from later stages of production to the earlier stages. Now, there's no problem here. People, for whatever reason, become more future-oriented. They're willing to consume less now so that they can consume more in the future. The interest rate changes, here it's going down, in response to a real change in preferences. The market for savings and investment is still in equilibrium. It's just the equilibrium has changed from here to there. Now, let me change that graphic. Give me just a moment. Okay. But what happens if the interest rate goes down for a different reason? What if it's pushed down out of equilibrium? Here in the graph, the lower right, we see that supply and demand have not changed at all, but the price in the interest rate has gone down. That means that the market for savings is no longer in equilibrium. At this artificially lower interest rate, people don't want to save much. That's here. But everybody wants to borrow to invest. So on the top right, you can see because people at this lower interest rate want to save less. We start at point A. If they're saving less, that means they're going to consume more. So consumption goes up. But because the interest rate is lower, people also want to invest more. Consumption and investment both go up to point B. But that's beyond the possibility frontier. You can't consume and invest the same resources. So although you can get to point B temporarily, you can't stay there. It is not sustainable. And here we go. I want to emphasize that temporarily it is possible to get to the point outside the frontier, point B. So by pushing the interest rate artificially below equilibrium, you can temporarily increase both consumption and investment, which makes the economy suddenly grow. This is the boom time in the business cycle. But it's like a Ponzi scheme. The stimulus looks like it's working, but it's not sustainable, and eventually it has to collapse. And since capital is heterogeneous, reallocating resources back to a sustainable production structure takes time and is costly. That's the recession. So where Keynesians see economic stimulus as the solution to an economic downturn, Austrians see it as the cause of the next recession. And I really should have turned off the animations here. Here we go. Now, this is the same sequence, but shown in a bit more detail. Austrian theory says that the way to understand economic recessions and depressions is by looking at the boom period that happened before. It's during the boom period when unsustainable investments are made, which ultimately have to be liquidated during the bust. In a typical cycle, the central bank will artificially lower interest rates by buying assets and flooding the banking system with new money. The lower interest rates are a stimulus to investment and consumer spending. But the prosperity is not sustainable because the amount of real savings has not increased. You can't increase consumption and increase investment because there isn't enough real wealth to do both. The central bank can keep the illusion of boom times going for several years if it continues to provide easy credit to keep interest rates artificially low, but eventually reality will reassert itself to bite you. The boom typically ends when rising prices, because remember, the central bank has flooded the economy with money. That'll cause inflationary expectations to rise, which will cause the interest rate to rise. Remember the Fisher equation. And that, once the interest rate goes up, many of these long-term projects that were financed and begun at the lower interest rate are revealed to be unprofitable. At higher interest rates, business owners realize they had been overly optimistic, and they begin laying off workers or shutting down entirely. The euphoric boom times turn into a miserable recession. In the Austrian analysis, the way to avoid painful recessions is to avoid the preceding boom. That means during a recession, it's bad policy to slash interest rates and try to stimulate aggregate demand, which is, of course, the textbook Keynesian prescription. According to Austrians, trying to ease the pain of the recession through the use of inflation and cheap credit is just sowing the seeds of the next recession. Which brings us back to where we started, making fun of Paul Krugman, because it's easy to do. Thank you for watching.